singularity.
So I'm here with a person who does need no introduction in the community of artificial intelligence, for the simple reason that many people have called him the father of artificial intelligence. And I'm incredibly happy and very excited to welcome Dr. Marvin Minsky on Singularity One-on-One. It's an honor.
Oh, thank you. Hello.
So, Dr. Minsky, my goal here is to ask you, hopefully, some questions that you haven't been asked too often before. So, let me see if I will be successful in this attempt of mine or not by starting in this way. Can you perhaps share with us the personal story of how you got interested in artificial intelligence and why?
Well, when I was a young student, I found a book called My Mathematical Biophysics in Widener Library. And this was a wonderful book of essays by a scientist named Nicholas Reshevsky. And it was a collection of little mathematical theories about various aspects of biology. And each of these essays took some biological phenomenon like cell division or metabolism or function of some particular kind of cells, like connections between neurons and so forth, and made a miniature mathematical theory of some aspect of that biological phenomenon. And each chapter took some completely different biological subject and made some assumptions about what was going on, replaced each assumption by a mathematical equation or postulate, and then solved that set of equations and predicted some particular effect or phenomenon. So each chapter was a beautiful little self-contained way of understanding some phenomenon. And as a child, I had been interested in mathematics and science and many things like that, but I had never seen them all put together in such clear and unambiguous ways. Now, each of these theories is presumably correct in some aspects and completely wrong in others because it's an oversimplification. But I thought it was beautifully done, and some of the chapters were by other people than Reshevsky, and by a wonderful set of accidents, I met virtually all the people who had contributed to that collection of studies in the next few years. This was just shortly after World War II. I went to college in 1946, which was just after I spent a year in the Navy in 1945, but the war ended then, and that ended with me being admitted to Harvard and meeting all the wonderful people who had been displaced from Europe during World War II. So there were a great many great scientists in that area, and over the next few years I met many of these great people. I had lunch with Einstein and Gödel and Robert Oppenheimer and many people who figured in the second half of the 20th century science.
That must have been absolutely amazing experience to get to meet Einstein and Gödel and Oppenheimer and all those people.
Yes, and it seemed like an everyday event for someone living at Harvard and MIT and Princeton, and sort of I spent many years shuttling between these institutions and talking to those people.
So how did you make the jump from mathematics and biology and interested in sort of how the brain works to your consequent interest in artificial intelligence, or what came to be known later as artificial intelligence?
Well, it was the same thing all along, because in this first book by Reshevsky, there were many little theories, particularly a little paper by McCulloch and Pitts on how neurons could compute various things and how they might learn in one or two different ways. And given that start, it was easy to imagine other ways to that things like neurons could learn. I started to make my own theories of this, and then I got interested in the question of how did neurons actually work. And one problem was that there was no way in the late 1940s and early 1950s to observe these things very well. And in the hope of seeing what's going on better, I started to invent new kinds of microscopes, and spent a couple of years developing that sort of thing. I invented the confocal microscope, which was an instrument that had a higher resolving power than the machines available of those times. And by the time I finished it, I got more interested in the theories of how the nervous system worked. And I made one set of pictures of a few neurons and never turned the machine on again, even though I had spent a couple of years making it work.
So let me ask you this. Was your primary motivation to figure out a way to put all of the different pieces together, or was it something else?
It was... At the beginning, I thought, as many people did, that understanding how neurons work would be the first thing to do, and then you would put those ideas together and figure out how larger and larger parts of the brain work until you ultimately, someday in the distant future, you'd understand the whole thing. And then fairly suddenly, it seemed to me that many people had tried that, and that the current theories in the 1950s were, if anything, worse than the ones in the 1860s and 70s. And I ran across the writings of several theorists. William James had theories. The early Freud had a interesting theory of how neurons learned, which didn't actually ever get published till 1950, because nobody in the... I think he wrote the Project for Scientific Psychology in 1895, around then, and he couldn't get anyone to publish it. And it was finally published in 1950, and it was full of interesting ideas about how neurons might learn. And
let me ask you this. Perhaps you can tell us. I mean, I was very impressed and very struck by, the accomplishment of your students and the obvious impact that you have had on their life. People, the two people present on our conference here, ISTAS 2013, Raymond Kurzweil and Steve Mann. But I want to ask you, from your own point of view, what's the thing that you're most proud of as your accomplishment that you hold dearest?
Well, maybe I wrote a review of theories called Steps Toward Artificial Intelligence around 1970. And that sort of charted several possible lines of research. which pretty much predicted what several communities of researchers would do in the next 20 years. Those predictions started to fall apart around, so that paper was 1970, roughly, and by the late 1980s, the world had changed, and it was interesting because when I started research in that general area, almost all of my students soon became professors. Maybe 70 or 80% of them became graduate students, wrote theses. These became pretty influential, and they got appointments in the universities and started their own research groups. So up to the 1970s and 80s, this field called artificial intelligence kept developing. Somehow, by 1980, though, the opportunities for starting new research groups in that area declined. And one reason is that, at least in the United States, there's no age limit on professors. But more serious was that most of this research had been financed by imaginative leaders in the Defense Department, particularly in the Office of Naval Research, which had an almost continuous inheritance of scientifically oriented commanders of various sorts. You could go all the way back to Hermann Weyl, who was a great mathematical physicist who taught Einstein the theory of tensors, which enabled Einstein to make his theories of relativity and gravitation. And Hermann Weyl's son, Joachim Weyl, was in the Office of Naval Research in the 1940s and was partly responsible for helping scientists escape from Hitler's empire in Europe in the late stages of World War II and exporting them to Harvard and Princeton and places, MIT and places like that, where I met most of them as a young student. So it's sort of interesting phase of history where these great refugees accumulated, and partly because of this accidental connection with the military. Unfortunately, in the later 1970s and 80s, some liberal politicians in the United States decided that it was kind of immoral for the military to be doing basic research when they should be paying more attention to killing people, which was their official job. And this wonderful system of supporting basic science and research literally fell apart in the United States, so that by 1980, as I was saying, in the 1960s, all of my students virtually became professors and did basic research. By the 1980s, virtually none of them, because the American universities had stopped expanding because there was very little basic research money, which had been coming from the military. And civilian money was never very good at basic research. Well, that's not really true. The great monopolies like IBM and Bell Labs, particularly, had been able to do basic research because they had very little competition. But as the anti-monopoly laws became stronger and the liberals got more power than the capitalists, the quality of basic science declined. It's a paradox that very few people understood while it was happening.
That's a very interesting story about how funding for artificial intelligence got scarce. But let me ask you, do you have personally any mistakes that you regret doing in any of your long and profound career that you think that if you were doing today, you would have done differently?
Can't think of any offhand, but there must be quite a few. But
for example, any with the theory of mind or artificial intelligence and the potential routes to accomplishing that?
No, I think I made some strategic mistakes. My first book about artificial intelligence was a book called The Society of Mind, and it had one-page chapters. And this book was very influential because it had the feature that if you didn't understand one of these chapters, you could just skim it, and it wouldn't matter very much. And the result was that great numbers of high school students understood most of the theories and knew more than their professors did when they got to college. And then I wrote a second book called The Emotion Machine, which had longer, more conventional chapters. And it has slightly better theories, but they're much harder to understand because I didn't break them into tiny portions. So that was, I think, a mistake. And I hope to write a third book which simplifies the later theories so that more younger people can understand them.
Let me ask you this. Once you said that science fiction writers are the unacknowledged engineers of our world, would you mind elaborating a little bit on that, on the importance of science fiction in general and perhaps on your worldview or pursuit of artificial intelligence in particular?
Well, when I was a child, I ran across various books, and one of the most influential was a book of short stories by H.G. Wells, which may be 20 different stories in which he makes some hypothesis, like somebody inventing anti-gravity. And as soon as you invent anti-gravity, you can make a inexpensive spaceship and go to the moon and find out what's there and stuff like that. And each of these H.G. Wells stories has some good idea, which won't work, but opens up some possibilities. And there's Jules Verne in 1900. And
what do you think of stories like Frankenstein, which are often given as an example of the fact that we shouldn't be meddling with certain things because we are going to be playing God, or we're going to just...
Well, Frankenstein was exactly the opposite. Here, that this intelligent creature was created and well-motivated, and prejudiced people destroyed it. So it was a morality tale, which is usually misinterpreted. But anyway, then there was a little vacuum, but between H.G. Wells and those people in Aldous Huxley, so forth, in the early 20th century. But they, just as I was running out of them, then a new generation appeared with Isaac Asimov. John Campbell, the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, started to write in the 1940s, 30s and 40s. And by accident, I happened to be in just the right place. Isaac Asimov lived nearby. And when I started to, that group to make robots and things like that, Isaac was around to discuss it. He refused to come to the lab to see them, and I wondered why. And he said, well, I'm writing about really intelligent robots of the future. And I'm sure that if I came and saw the clumsy ones that you guys are making, it would spoil my
imagination.
Right, and I reluctantly agreed that he was right.
That reminds me to my interview with Daniel Wilson, who wrote a book, How to Defeat a Terminator kind of robot uprising. So, for example, how do you escape from a robot? You just walk away very slowly, he said. Anyway, what's your take on the technological singularity?
Well, there's progress, and I've been watching it slow down for the last 8 or 10 years, so I'm a little bit not less optimistic about when it will happen.
Very interesting. So you think it's decelerating rather than accelerating?
Well, in artificial intelligence, it's certainly well, because of this phenomenon that very few young people who show promise have been able to get jobs. So I haven't seen very much progress in the last 10 or 15 years.
What about examples such as Watson, such as Siri on our phones, or Google Translator, and many other such, quote, artificial intelligence system?
Well, Siri is pretty good, but it's quite old.
But isn't it improving constantly?
I don't think it knows that you can pull things with a string, but you can't push them.
Uh-huh. I see.
But they're improving a bit, but not in the way that they were in the 60s and 70s and early 80s.
So let's say on the one hand you have people like Ray Kurzweil who very bravely have published a timeline of the way he perceives the future would unfold with respect to that. And on the other hand you have skeptics who say that artificial intelligence is kind of like fusion. We're always 30 years away from it, but we're never any closer. Whereabouts do you stand on that?
Well, it depends. I think it depends on how many smart people get to work on it. And it's hard to predict, because I would never have predicted that there would be fewer people working on AI now than 10 years ago. But there are no jobs. Mm-hmm. There might be 20 people working on Watson, but 20 years ago there were 100 people working, or maybe 200 working on artificial intelligence. And now I think there's half as many.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the push and the pull with a string as one of the indicators of how smart an artificial intelligence system is. Let me ask you about the Turing test. Do you think that that's a good test, or is it too human-specific to be any good or bad about evaluating the intelligence of an artificial intelligence?
The Turing test is a joke, about saying a machine would be intelligent if it does things that an observer would say must be being done by a human. So it was suggested by Alan Turing as one way to evaluate a machine, but he had never intended it as being the way to decide whether a machine was really intelligent. So it's not a serious question.
I see. So, Dr. Minsky, what would you say to any young person who today is interested in doing research in artificial intelligence? What's the best advice you can give them?
Well, there certainly still are plenty of opportunities to stay in the academic world and teach computer science. There are lots of jobs in industry to develop applications of artificial intelligence, but it's hard to find opportunities to do basic research. So I'm not sure what kind of advice to give. Don't give up is the main piece of advice.
Don't give up. I like that. And what do you say to people who, like Professor Gary Marcus, for example, are suggesting that the path towards artificial intelligence will be not a result of neuroscience, but at the crossroads between psychology and neuroscience? By bridging the two sciences, he claims, is the best approach to artificial intelligence.
I'm neutral about that. I haven't seen much. There was a lot of progress in a subject called cognitive psychology in the 1960s and 70s, but I haven't seen it developing very well in the 80s and 90s. So it seems to have cooled down.
Well, his take was that much of the investment was taken by neuroscience, and therefore, in his point of view, just like you said, there was not enough research in artificial intelligence. For him, the money went into artificial intelligence and neuroscience, and there was none left for psychology. That was his argument when I interviewed him on the show. What do you think about that?
Well, I think artificial intelligence has been the main progress in psychology. I don't think psychology itself has progressed much, but I could be wrong about that, and there could be major theories that just haven't become popular. But I haven't seen them.
You keep telling us about the importance of theories. Why do you think that having a theory, is the crucial thing on the way to accomplishing that task?
Well, a good example is that there's now a interesting movement to spend $1 billion making a map of the nervous system.
Dr. Henry Markram's.
Whatever it is, there's several of them. And I'd say there's a 98% chance that they will not map the right aspects of the nervous system that they'll need to understand how it works. What they should do is spend their $1 billion on the housefly or the Drosophila and make sure they understand it thoroughly before wasting money on wrong theories of what to map in the human brain.
Very interesting.
Because they may cause a 50-year waste of discouragement. If that project doesn't produce much, it would cause great delay.
Oh yeah, that reminds me to something that you said yesterday during the conference. You said we had a lot of bad theories that became very popular in the 70s.
Well, not the...
Or the 80s.
Well, recently.
Recently, okay.
The current ways of trying to represent the nervous system in terms of probabilities, I don't think are much of an advance over what we had 50 years ago.
Perhaps you're referring to whole brain emulation?
No, I'm referring to probabilistic models of learning.
I see. Well, Dr. Minsky, it's been a pleasure interviewing you. Let me ask you the very last question that I always ask of guests on my show, and that is, what is the final message that you want to send out to people who would watch this half-an-hour interview with you? If they were to take one message from you today, what would you like that to be?
Well, I'm not interested in everything, and if I'm really interested in good researchers and helping them get on the right path. And as far as what I've learned from my own career is find the person whose thinking you admire most and go and meet that person and see if you can copy him.
singularity.